So this is our lovely author, Erin Bartels, and I'm going to read a little bit of her official bio before we start picking her brain, asking questions. Um, Erin Bartels writes character-driven fiction for curious people. Her readers know to expect that each of her novels will tell a unique story about fallible characters so tangible that it's hard to believe they are not real people. And I don't know about you guys, but I found that to be true. And I know a couple of members of the group have mentioned, like, I wonder if this is based on a family story or something. So we'll get to that later. Um, but it says her themes of reckoning with the past, improving the present, and looking with hope to the future leave her readers with a sense of peace and possibility. And I really felt that in this book too. She is a two-time Christie finalist and winner of 2 WFWA Star Awards and 2 Michigan Notable Book Awards. Erin has been a publishing professional for more than 20 years. After 18 years in Michigan's capital city, she now lives with her family in a charming small town surrounded by farm fields and pasture lands. So welcome, Erin.
Thank you.
And so, yeah, I was curious about that because this is set in Michigan. Are you still in Michigan, just a more rural area? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so a Michigander, and I am originally from Ohio, and we have a couple of Ohioans on here, so we're neighbors.
I was born in Ohio.
Oh, fun. What part?
Youngstown. I only lived there 6 months, so I don't really remember it.
Not a lot of memories. Yes. Well, yeah. So I grew up not far from there in the Akron, Ohio area, Akron, Canton, and Linda and Christine are still in that northeastern Ohio area. So
great.
Fun. So I would love if you would just start by sharing your author journey. Like, did you always want to be an author? How did you come to be an author?
Sure. Well, how long do you have?
We have 1 hour. Go.
We'll do a flyover for that one. Yeah, so I think like most authors, I've always been a big reader and always really enjoyed reading. And I went to college for an English degree. And during that time, you know, when you go to college for English, you have, at least in that time, you'd spend a lot of time reading dead white men. And they are kind of put on another level, they seem really, really genius or whatever because your professors love them. And then I started working, after I was done with my bachelor's degree, I started working at a publisher, which made publishing seem much less heady and less inaccessible. And you meet lots and lots of authors and they're just very regular people. So it makes it seem a little bit more accessible, like something that you could actually do. And your opinion actually matters because you're a reader, whereas in academia, your opinion doesn't matter until you have the right letters behind your name. So eventually, working with authors for several years, I just decided, I think now I have something to say. I think I always wanted to write, but I didn't really have anything that I felt was worth saying until I was in my 30s. So I didn't really finish anything before that.
Neat. So how many books have you written?
I have 6 books published, novels, and then I have a collection of short stories. And there was one that I wrote beforehand that was not published and will never be published, and that's good. You know, and it's not that it was so horrible, but it just wasn't there. And I sort of did some grave digging and took some things from it for a later book. So there's really no reason to do anything with the carcass that is remaining.
The manuscript that will remain in a drawer, but at least you've found ways to repurpose parts of it.
Yeah, and actually it was really, I think, it was a really good thing that it wasn't published, because the story that I eventually wrote that took elements from that is my favorite of the things that I've written, I think.
Okay, and which book is that?
It's called The Girl Who Could Breathe Underwater.
It's also on my TBR list.
Right.
That's my favorite of yours too, Erin.
Is it really? Oh, that's
Although
great.
I've read all of them except The Words Between Us. That's the only one I have left to read. But
All right.
yeah, I've loved all of them too.
Oh, thank
okay,
you.
not to hijack or anything. Okay.
And so we read together this month, We Hope for Better Things. Where does that fall in the lineup of the order in which you have written your books?
Yes, so that's my first book
Okay.
that was published. That's and that was a manuscript that I started writing. So the one that will never be published, I finished in 2012. And then during 2013, I was researching what would become We Hope for Better Things. And then I started writing it in 2014 and eventually got an agent and an editor, and it finally came out in January of 2019. So it was a long journey.
That is
because it's a big book. I mean, it's kind of complicated with
Mhm.
3 lines and
Yeah.
stuff like
Yeah, with all those storylines, that
Yeah.
was fascinating to me how you wove that through, and we could see in 3 different timelines what people were dealing with all around this same issue of interracial relationships. So, a couple of people have asked, why this topic? Do you have that in your family, or was it just a curiosity, or?
Nope. I don't have it in my family, although my family is from Detroit. So there is a lot of information that comes from their experiences there. My parents are both from Detroit. Well, my mom's from Detroit. My dad grew up in Birmingham and Bloomfield Hills. And so they were really, really good reference points and resources for finding out really what everyday life was like in the 60s timeline, the 1960s. And then obviously I did a lot of research. And the initial idea for the book really sprang from my great aunt was leaving her home and going into assisted living. And she has 2 sons and no grandchildren. And her sons were not terribly sensitive about going through her things with her. They kept coming into the room where my mom and I were actually like asking her about stories and talking to her about things that mattered, and brought in picture after picture saying, "Who is this?" And she would say who it is, and they would say, "Do you want to keep it?" And she would just eventually be like, "I guess it's not." Like, because if you're not interested, then why would I keep
Yeah,
it?
yeah.
I found that really sad. And so I was just sort of thinking about photography, and my dad was an amateur photographer. And I thought it's interesting when you're the photographer in your family, you're not in a lot of pictures. And until I had a phone that had a front facing camera, I was in no pictures because I was the photographer. And my dad's not in a lot of pictures because he was the photographer. And I just thought about the idea of finding old photos where the only thing you know is what you see. You don't know who took them, but there's always that extra person like that you don't see who's behind the camera. And what could you learn about that person by looking at what that person found important to keep in the photo? So that's the initial idea. And then I don't really remember when it attached itself to this interracial theme, or even necessarily the city of Detroit. And it was originally in my mind, I was thinking it would be a modern day and a World War II era, because that's the generation my great aunt was from. And then it had just kind of morphed into what it became. So, but we don't have any interracial couples in our family. We have an extremely small family, but I do have a very diverse church. And, when I lived in Lansing, that's an extremely diverse town. And there were just a lot of interesting questions around race and race relations and things like that during the time I was deciding what to write about. And then, of course, it just never is out of the news. And so it just becomes something that every year that goes by, I'm like, well, this is still timely, which is unfortunate in some ways, but good for me because the book is still selling.
Yes, very good for you. So talk to us a little bit about the research that went into this, especially with the three different
Yeah.
timelines.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. I read a lot. I read a lot very specifically about the Detroit riots because if you're talking about that kind of an event, you really need to know the details. And that kind of an event is very chaotic, but a lot has been written on it. So I did a lot of research into the riots themselves, lots of reading about life during the Civil War, but not in the Civil War. You know, you read a lot of Civil War books that are set in the South or set in the areas where there were actual battles. And in Michigan, there were no battles, but there was a huge abolitionist movement in Michigan, probably partially because of our proximity to Canada and the way out of this country. So, and there was a history of that in Detroit, and that kind of intersected with my interest because of my family story. And then in the 1960s, like I mentioned, my dad was an extremely important resource because he has a really good memory, whereas my mom doesn't. So my mom could tell me a few things, but he was the one who I could say, where would white kids go to a drive-in versus where would black kids go to the drive-in? What streets were this way and that way? What would people actually say, or would they say anything if they saw an interracial couple walking down the street in Detroit? It would be different than if they were seen in Jackson, Mississippi. You know, like that would be very different. But there's still this underlying feeling. And I got to hear a lot of stories from people. Like both my parents remember going through the riots, and they had very different experiences because of where they were. And I have a number of friends whose parents were involved in some way. A black friend of mine whose dad was a cop during the riots, which is very rare to have a black police officer at that time in Detroit, despite the fact that the population was a lot more than 3% black. They only had 3%
Yeah.
black people in the force, which is going to cause problems. And I have another friend whose dad was in a helicopter as part of the National Guard, going over the city. And, so there were all these people. You can't go anywhere in Michigan without running into somebody who used to live in Detroit. So as I've talked to a lot of different book clubs since this book came out, so many of them are like, oh, I remember where I was, and they'll tell me their story. And it's kind of a neat way for them to see their city, the city of their youth, kind of come back alive and that time. And then the modern storyline, there really wasn't a lot that I had to research because I sew, I quilt, I garden, I know these things. And so I was drawing a lot from my own experience in that regard.
Cool. Well, that was one of the things I was going to ask you. I always like to ask, there's always a kernel of truth in fiction. So it sounds like the gardening and the quilting, that was.
Yeah, well, and even the photography, firsthand experience with that and with my dad. And there's a lot of, I don't write anything that's about something that doesn't interest me. So I've actually noticed recently when my latest book came out, I was like, oh, these are all the subjects I enjoyed in school. So history, one of them's very focused on literature, one of them's hiking, so that's PE. The Girl Who Could Breathe Underwater is Summer Break. And then there's one that focuses on music, and the latest one focuses on art. So they're all just the things that I'm interested in and want to learn more about.
Well, as it should be, because you write a better story if you're interested.
I think so.
Yeah. So are there any characters or scenes or dialogue that you were like, yeah, I drew on something in my life?
It's been a long time since I actually wrote the book, so particular bits of dialogue don't come to mind. But I don't, except for one character in a different book, I have never knowingly based a character on anyone. So, like, they're not drawn from particular people I know, um, or even particular situations. I think that I start with kind of an idea of, well, this is kind of what I want to say. These are the themes I want to explore. This is the setting. These are the characters. And then the more you get to know your characters, the more the story develops on its own.
Yeah.
So I don't recall any particular things. I do know that a lot of the characteristics of the older version of Nora, the way she carries herself, and the way she comports herself, are kind of like my grandmother, my dad's mom, who was the sister of my great aunt who gave me the original idea. But other than that, no, I don't think so.
Okay. So you allude to this a little bit in your acknowledgments about how you are a Caucasian woman
Yes.
trying to write a story about race relations. And in some ways, that's a little bit bold to say, I can have a voice about this when it's not your experience. So, um, can you talk to us a little bit about that and
Yeah,
how you
okay.
went about making sure you got it right
Yeah.
because you are not a person of color?
Well, the very first thing I'll point out is that the three protagonists are all white. So I
True.
wasn't trying to write from the point of view, except for a little bit here and there, kind of getting things from JJ's perspective during the riots. Most of it was the point of view of three white women.
Mm-hmm.
So in that way, I'm writing about race, but from the perspective of a person who might not understand and who needs to ask questions and who can get it wrong. And so that I think is groundwork that's helpful. And I never considered writing from the perspective of any of the Black characters. And then what I did was I had a number of different people early on read the manuscript for a number of different reasons. So I have a friend who is the historian at the state capitol and knows everything about old furniture and old houses and things like that. And I'm like, read this and make sure I didn't call something a buffet when I should have said a sideboard or, whatever.
Yeah.
Because people like you will notice and they'll be annoyed. And then, I had men read for the male perspective. And I had four friends who are Black who read specifically for me, like the whole thing, but also I want you to talk to me and be honest with me about what you feel might be a problem. And one of them was really honest with me. The others were very nice about it. And it's not that I don't think it's not that they didn't find anything, but maybe we were too close of friends. And the person who is the most honest with me is also a writer. And I've read for her for white characters. She's read for me for Black characters. And it was really helpful. I was gratified that there were a lot of things that I got right just from being observant, being a good researcher, being a good listener. But then there were things that I hadn't thought of that were really interesting to me, like a perspective I wouldn't have been able to research. So she was really helpful in that regard. And Krista, you know her, it's Nancy Johnson.
So can you give us an example of one of those things that she pointed out to you?
Yeah, I can't remember the exact scene anymore, but there was one, gosh, I wish I could remember. I'm realizing now that it's been like a while since I've really dug
You've
into
written
this.
a few more books since then.
Just a few. So yeah, I mean, I was writing this a decade ago. I can't remember the exact scene, but I do remember Nancy pointing out that the particular character should have more agency. And that I remember thinking like, oh, that makes it so that the scene doesn't go the way that I was wanting it to. But because I needed to adjust things so that this person actually did more, and had more of a say in what they did, it became a more interesting scene. And sometimes when you get revision, into these revisions, you can end up with a lot more interesting and less common story. Even if it's just that little part of the story, it can go a lot more interesting ways, because your first inclination, I think, is probably affected a lot by the things that you read and you watch. And what you watch on TV or in a movie is a particular version of reality, and it's not necessarily reality.
Right.
So that was really helpful. And I wish I could remember what scene it was now. Oh well.
Well, one of the messages that I loved in this was that sometimes we have good intentions, but we're really missing the mark.
Mhm.
And so one of the things that I noticed was Nora's mother's comments when she has the miscarriage, and she's like,
Mm.
"Oh, well, it's probably for the best because you'd have this mulatto baby,
Mhm.
and how hurtful that was. But
Mhm.
yet I could also see that it was probably the best the mother could do. Like it was really good intentions that she would say that. And I think that we often might do the same thing. There was also the scene where she, Elizabeth and Tyrese, and she is suggesting that they go to, was it to Detroit to watch? Well, I wrote it down here somewhere. Um, it was a specifically Black performance.
Mm.
Um, Now I can't find it. I wrote it down.
Is it
And
ragtime or something like that?
Ragtime, yes, yes, that was it. And he kind of said, yeah, that like I don't belong in Detroit or watching Ragtime. And here, I'm imagining that she's probably saying this as like, I'm trying to reach into your culture and honor your culture. But sometimes we're trying and we're just getting it all wrong. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, or if anybody else in the book group has thoughts about that.
Well, there's definitely moments that I have said things where I was like, as I was saying them, I'm like, this isn't right. Like they weren't bad things, but I could see in the way, like, let's say my friend Deborah, who had the father who was the cop in Detroit. So we get together a lot for coffee and we go to the same church. And there have been a couple times during coffee where I sort of like see a certain expression come over her face. And then I start thinking like, okay, what did I say wrong? And she would never point it out, but I could tell her face just changed a little bit.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, something I said, it must be making some sort of assumptions or something. So yeah, it's an uncomfortable feeling. And I think everybody's gone through that, whether it's about race or not, like where you say something meaning well, and then a person takes it a different way that you didn't expect. Um, and it's complicated, and sometimes you just ignore it and everybody gets past it, and sometimes those things really stick around, and like they can ruin a friendship, or years
Mhm.
later your sister brings it up when she's angry about something else, like something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's very
And the thing is, like, we live in a time, I think now, where um it's strange. It's like white America took a really long time to catch up to some realities and realize like, oh, this is real. This is, they feel this way because of X, Y, and Z, and that makes sense. And they have every right to feel that way. And then wanting to repair things. But it's almost like all of a sudden you went too far in a certain way of talking about things, and it puts a lot of onus on the party that's been wronged to make you feel better about yourself. And I
Yeah.
think they're frankly getting real sick of that, and I don't blame them.
Right.
So it's a really strange time too, where like your intentions may be good, but Like if you don't think, do a little extra thought about what you're going to write or what you're going to say, and think about the way that might come across to someone um, before putting it out there, because it's real hard to find forgiveness now. I mean, there's a real like, okay, you said the wrong thing, so now you're punished and canceled and
Right.
cut
Yeah.
out of my life and whatever. So it's tough.
Yeah, and I think as we just stay aware and know that, I mean, we're all human. We're all going to make mistakes. We're all going to say the wrong thing, whether it's in race or, like you said, any relationship. If we can just stay aware of that and being willing to apologize and try to do it
Yeah,
better, you know, I
yeah.
think that's the best we
And
can
I
do.
think there's also something to be said for being quick to listen and slow to speak. Like you don't always have to say something.
Yeah, yeah, that is really good advice that very few people take. Another theme that I really liked was the reaction of the church in Michigan in the 1860s. And it's like
Mm,
you have all this community that are like, yes, let's free the slaves. Let's send our men out to fight for this cause. And okay, now they're sending these freed or escaped slaves up here for protection. But it's like, I want to support your cause just so long as I don't have to get my fingers too dirty.
yeah.
And I
Yeah,
think,
and you see the same attitude in Nora's father in the 1960s. Like, oh,
mhm,
I like this guy
right,
who mows the lawn, but
yes,
I don't want him involved with my daughter.
yeah, yes, exactly. Yeah, and just I was really struck by this church. It was saying, well, they can come, but only if they sit in the back. And this quote, we read the same scriptures, worship the same Lord. We may sing some different songs, but I can assure you that we have been faithful to God. And I just loved that so much and was just thinking about, you know, how can we be more welcoming to others, whether
Mhm.
it's just in our neighborhoods or our faith communities or where we work. I don't know if you or anybody else in the group has some thoughts on that, how to be more welcoming.
Well, I think one of the things that so in our church, we've had a lot of experience with refugee groups coming through, and some of them staying for quite a long time until they got too big for the church. And we've had a lot of experience, individual members teaching English and doing sort of the preparation for the citizenship test. And you basically can become kind of a default social worker because there's so many ways in which they're just on their own. Like you just, they all have caseworkers, but the caseworker never answers the phone.
Yeah,
And you're going through mail, and I've talked to landlords and talked them out of evicting people. You know, I've been to hospitals with people to make sure they're understood. And one of the main things that I have found in working with these different groups is even if you don't speak the same language, you come from very different backgrounds. Um, One of the main things, two of the main things that have that bring people together in those cases are food and worship, even though we didn't speak the same language. Uh, so I think that fellowship is a really big part of it, and just inviting people to things and going to things when you're invited and contributing and just talking to people like they're normal people. And you don't
mhm,
always have to talk about the issues.
right.
Like get to know people because you want to get to know them and you want them to be an actual friend, not because you feel like you need a project or you need to check off a certain demographic in your friend group.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think when there's a language barrier too, sometimes we can look at others like they're less intelligent because they're not
Mm-hmm.
speaking our language, but really they're more intelligent because they are multilingual and we are not. And
Right.
so it's easy to just kind of go, oh, well, they can't speak my language or, you know, they
Yeah.
don't know the culture.
Yeah, I mean, I remember a time when I was helping, there were a couple boys in the family that I worked with who were school age, and I put a lot of work into them because they were the most likely to actually learn the language and be able to help their family
Hmm.
because they could do both. And they were going through school, they're just put in school, they speak no English. there's no dictionary that goes from English to their language. There's their language to English, but there's no dictionary that goes the other way because it's a very small language group. And I just felt so badly for them trying to pass classes in a different, I'm like, don't they have like a special program? There's so many refugees in Lansing. I couldn't believe that there wasn't a special program just for them that focused on learning the language and learning things you actually need to know, because they were reading classics of English literature that were in dialect, like To Kill a Mockingbird, and I'm like, well, people who speak English as a first language have trouble with this. Like, I don't know what you expect from these guys. And there was one day that the younger son came to our session and he said, I have to write a poem. What's a poem? And I was like, they didn't explain this, like, and somebody could look at somebody like that and be like, well, I mean, that's pretty dumb. You don't know what a poem is.
Right.
But nobody had explained it. So, we took some time and went through it, and it really is just like seeing that we're all exactly the same in our common humanity, and thinking about putting yourself in their shoes. If I went to Burma, I wouldn't know the language.
Right.
I wouldn't know anything. I wouldn't know how to do anything there. And that doesn't mean I'm dumb. That just means I don't know what I'm doing.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I interact quite a bit with some Spanish speakers at our church, and they're always like, is my English okay? And I just say, it's better than my Spanish. I mean, let's be real. So, yeah, that's some good perspectives. Anybody else have any
Well,
thoughts on that?
I just think that if we as the church don't become the heart of Jesus, then we fail.
Yeah.
That's our mission.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we're called to do. And so everything, Erin, that you're saying is what we're supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
And, we shouldn't be waiting for the government to do anything. We should just,
no, because you're going to be waiting a long time.
we're going to be waiting a long, long time. And, we should just take it upon ourselves as the church to say, be the heart and hands of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly what we should be doing. And, like my, one of my, well, actually, she was my college roommate. She teaches English as a second language. And she's like, part of the problem with teaching kids, she teaches Nepali kids mostly in her room.
Oh, yeah, we have a Nepali group in our church now.
Yeah. And she's like, the problem is that you still have to teach these kids to the instructions of what the state of Ohio says that they need to be taught to. So it doesn't matter that they don't understand To Kill a Mockingbird. They still have to, you still have to teach it to them.
Yeah.
So until we figure out a way to turn it around and say, these 11th grade kids are not ever going to understand To Kill a Mockingbird. They just came to our country from a refugee camp. So unless we come in and say, hey, I've got some free time, I will sit with these kids and tutor them.
Yeah.
She's like, I don't have.
It's really gratifying. Like the kids that I worked with, like the older son now, I helped him with his college applications. He went to college. He's a minister now in their church. He's writing books.
Wow.
And he's married and just has a little baby now. And, being able to see people move from coming with absolutely nothing. That's not an exaggeration. Nothing. To buying houses and buying cars and fitting into this system that we've got is really, really gratifying.
Absolutely.
That's cool. That's really cool. Another one of the themes that I liked in this book was the theme of forgiveness. And we see Nora not being able to forgive and reconcile with her parents. And there was a quote, it says, "It took effort and sacrifice not to forgive them." And I thought, how often do we do that in our own lives? Like we hang on to whatever we're upset about with somebody else. And we put effort into that, like licking our wounds and wanting revenge or retribution or, just fairness somehow. And then towards the end, she says, "Today has me wondering what the last 50 years might have been like if I had forgiven my parents and forgiven JJ. Maybe I would have been happier." And I was just thinking, I think it's true. Forgiveness is not for the person you're forgiving, it's for yourself. And when you're busy hanging on to all those things that have upset you and refusing to forgive, you're really hurting yourself, not the other person. And probably Elda could speak to us about that more than anything. Elda is an expert on emotions. Do you have anything to share about that, Elda?
Actually, it's funny that you that you bring that up, because that's the one question that I wanted to ask you as an author when you were doing the research. I wanted to ask about your emotions. Did you find yourself, because I mean, there was so much detail. As at going through it, I'm like, wow, she really did her homework to get it right, what was happening in 3 different timelines, right? So I was wondering if you experienced any emotions when you were going through it. And the reason I ask is because I'm getting ready to go to in October, I'm going to a civil rights pilgrimage down to Alabama and Georgia. And I didn't really know that much about it. So, because I feel like I didn't get taught that in school. But so I've been reading all these books and watching all these movies, and I found myself getting angry, actually.
Yeah, well, if you didn't, I'd feel like maybe there was something wrong with you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think one of the most powerful tools that a writer has is empathy. If you can actually try to put yourself in the shoes of people who have different experiences than you, because if you didn't try to do that, then you're just writing about what you know. And I think that writers should strive to write bigger. It's good to write what you know, but there's so much more out there, and there's so much growth that happens when you stretch beyond what you know and you try to imagine what life is like for other people. And so, yeah, if you researched the history of race in America and didn't feel, and I know there's lots of people who feel their own self-righteous anger about things, and they'll hold on to that, and they're not willing to feel the thing that the other person feels. But yeah, the more you research a subject like that, the more heartache you're going to encounter. And like, for instance, I think that one of the most challenging things I've ever written is from JJ's perspective during the riots, because it's nothing like anything I've experienced. I've never been in that situation. I've never been a young boy in that situation. I've never been a young Black boy in that situation. There's no way in which my life has prepared me to understand what he went through. And rather than reading a lot of firsthand accounts from children who went through that, I just put myself in that situation with all of the research I'd done behind that, not just that event, but the way race was talked about in that time, and the different types of groups, the more militant groups, the more pacifist groups, and the way people treated young Black men, especially during that time, and thought, man, if I were him, I would be angry. I would be really angry. But I also like that he notices things during the riots that make him kind of pause and say, well, that guy's a nice guy. Why did you loot his store? Like, he's nice to us. Or noticing a girl he knows from his school and realizing that he's trespassing on their property and taking their things, because they were taking the things off the clothesline to make Molotov cocktails. And I liked those little glimpses of, like, everyone knows what it's like to be a kid where you're sort of following one thing, but you know you shouldn't. You're kind of doing what these kids want to do, like, oh, these kids are the popular kids, and so I'm going to do it. But I know I'm not supposed to. I'm not supposed to go to that R-rated movie or whatever it is. Like, everybody's had a tiny bit of that experience. And so I think it's taking that and marrying that your tiny bit of experience being a kid and feeling uncomfortable with that particular situation and doing lots of research that, yeah, really made me angry and sad.
I appreciate you mentioning that empathy is such an important part of being an author. I guess I hadn't thought of that before, but you're right. It's the difference between a book that expresses so much feeling and gets the reader really involved, or a book that's just on facts. This happened.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that I find that books where even the bad characters, like, you can kind of understand them, those are more interesting to me than okay, this is the good character and this is the bad character. I like more nuance because people are really nuanced, because every one of us is good and bad. And yeah, I think that it becomes much more interesting when what I strive to do is whatever character I'm writing, I want to write as if they're the protagonist of their own story. Even if they're the antagonist, they're the protagonist in their story, and what they're doing makes sense to them. So I try to get close to that and feel not like I'm standing in judgment of my characters, even when they do things that maybe I don't think they should do, but more from a feeling of, coming alongside and understanding.
Very cool.
Thank you. That was
Yeah.
beautiful. Thank you.
Does anybody else have questions for Erin that we haven't covered? Krista?
Krista does.
I mean, the issue of race in this is at the forefront and huge, of course. But I admit there's a way I was more captivated by more of the undertone message of, does God allow everything to happen for a reason?
Mm.
And I read your author's note, and you had said how you were okay if this book makes some people uncomfortable. And I wouldn't say that part made me uncomfortable, but I would think if there's a way, if something was going to make me uncomfortable, that would make me the most uncomfortable. If that makes any sense. What I'm really not saying very well is I admire your bravery for allowing some pretty deplorable, kind of awful. You can't really think of much more terrible things happening to characters who still keep the faith that God allowed this to happen for a reason. And I guess this isn't really a question, but I just wonder if you felt trepidatious about, to me that was very bold to be putting that in there. And I just wonder if you could elaborate on your experience of doing that.
Oh, well, I think that, fundamentally, that's a question that everybody asks at some point, I think, because everybody has something terrible happen to them. You lose someone, something falls apart, people die, people go through absolute hell on earth through sickness, and you do have to reckon at some point with the question of, if you believe in God, and if you believe that God is good and loving and all-powerful, then you have to reckon with, well, why doesn't he stop this? Why doesn't he make this not happen? Why is there suffering? All of those things. And even if you believe that you know why they're suffering because there's sin in the world. And God is in the process of making that right, reconciling people to himself, offering forgiveness and redemption and resurrection. But even if you believe all of those things, you still run into the things that don't make sense. So over the past 2 years, my father-in-law and my father have both died. My father-in-law died of lung cancer. He never smoked. He was not diagnosed until it was stage 4 and inoperable. He did go through chemo, and I think from the time that he was diagnosed to the time of his death was 7 months.
Wow.
My father was diagnosed with a brain tumor in March, and he was dead by May. So you have to reckon with that, because there's no reason that we can see that God wouldn't answer certain types of prayers. Prayers for a family member to come to faith that never get answered. Why wouldn't he say yes to that? So I think that those are the difficult things. Like, you have to, if you believe that God is sovereign and nothing happens apart from his will, that means the good things and the bad things. And I think it's a theme that comes up in multiple books of mine, because it's something that I don't think has an easy answer. It's easy to say, well, this is character building for me, or I just don't see the fullness of his plan. And those are true, but they don't always help you in the moment. So I don't really have an answer for you. I just have the question.
Well, if I could ask another one then, oh shoot, I lost it. Okay, somebody else can go. It'll come back to me.
We'll figure it out.
Well, I was thinking, building on this, the conversation that we're having, is that I think God allows all of us agency. I think that's part of our purpose here on earth, is that he's saying, here you go, I've created this for you, and you get to make choices. I'm not going to force you into anything, really. You get to choose. And so a lot of the evil and the things that we have to reconcile sometimes can be like, well, that's because God is allowing everyone to choose, and some people's choices are affecting other people. That's one of the answers that I go back to. But things like getting lung cancer when you've never smoked, there aren't good answers for all of those things. But yeah, and that's where faith comes in too, because I think if we could see all the answers and understand it perfectly, there would be no faith. It would just be like, okay, great, thanks for handing me all the answers on a platter.
And ultimately, that is the first sin. Wanting the knowledge of good and evil, and wanting to understand all of those things, that's above our pay grade.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't stop us from wanting it, I think, because we're made in God's image, but yeah, that's not, I also think that there's a certain personality, and there's definitely been a certain time that this was kind of taught, I would say in the mid-century through at least the 1980s, that every problem has a solution. We just have to, better living through science. We'll figure it all out. Every disease has an antibiotic, and eventually you get to the realization of like, oh no, I don't think these people know what they're talking about. They're just regular people. And they make mistakes, sometimes really big ones, and we're dealing with the consequences.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people's choices that affect us. and it's good to remember that my choices affect other people in ways that I can't even imagine sometimes.
Yeah. And that kind of brings us back to where we started, of race and dealing with other cultures and other people and saying the wrong thing. It's sometimes we are making those mistakes that are affecting other people, and it's good to be aware of that. Krista, did your question come back to you yet?
Well, I'm afraid it's one of those questions that's more of like a comment, maybe. I don't know if it's gonna be helpful, but I guess I did like in this book how there were Christians in crisis of faith, in a sense. I guess Christians doing some very non-Christian things, like, and it was interesting to me how you had, I believe it's Mary, sorry, and I'm not very good at remembering names, in the Civil War
Mhm.
era. I'm committing adultery. But you know, being so strong in faith in certain respects, but then I suppose this you can really empathize with why this particular sin was on her Achilles heel, for lack of a better phrase. And I wonder if you got any backlash over things like that.
You know, I really didn't.
Oh, good.
And related to that, I'll tell you, when I signed the contract for this book, well, before I signed it, I'm publishing these books with a Christian publisher. And I said right from the beginning, I am not signing a contract and then removing this scene later. This is a plot. This is necessary for the plot. It is not gratuitous. It causes things to happen. I'm also not removing the 2 N words that stayed in there because they are things that cause things to happen. They're plot specific. And they were like, that's fine. You can have adultery. You can have the N word. But later on, when my editor was going through it, there was a scene when Nora and William were smoking, because everybody smoked in the 60s. And she was like, oh, I think you should take that. I'm just like, really? It's like, oh yeah, people, you'll get dinged for that. People won't like that in reviews. And I'm like, well, that's dumb. I'm keeping it because of that. And then ultimately I was like, well, I guess they don't really have to. It's not anything that's related to the plot. So I thought, all right, fine. I will take that stumbling block away from people. But it was interesting to me that they're like, we're fine with adultery, but no smoking, please. Which is kind of a strange double standard. And there's a lot of times, and I am frankly surprised that they would publish something that had adultery in it from one of the main characters that was not in the past, and she wasn't even ashamed of at first. Because typically what you see in Christian fiction is if anything bad has happened, it's happened to the character. If it's something like that.
Mhm.
Never anything that they made a choice to do. But I'm sorry, I'm a pastor's wife and I hear a lot of things and I know what people struggle with. And there is in every single person the potential to commit every sort of sin and break any of the 10 commandments. And to pretend that there's not, I don't think is helpful. I think it's helpful to see this is a bad situation. The fact that she was alone for so long does not excuse her, but it helps it make it more understandable.
Mhm. Mhm.
The fact that she was, angry and hurt and felt abandoned and felt dismissed by her husband and was spending most of her time with a man who was really nice and helpful and attuned to her needs and a really good friend. Of course that's going to happen. Of course it is. It's going to be something that somebody struggles with at the very least. So I was really surprised, but I have not gotten anyone. I don't read reviews, so I don't know. Maybe there are people out there on Goodreads who are just really angry about this, probably because I think people on Goodreads are angry. But I have not personally received any emails from angry readers. Yeah, and what's interesting is I also haven't received any angry emails from people who read the book and thought I was completely off base about how I treated Black characters or anything like that. I've been very surprised because I was kind of bracing myself for people to be angry about things. And the only people that I've seen, because I did look at reviews early on just to see how it was landing, and the only angry people are women in their 30s who are white and who are outraged on behalf of someone else who's not outraged. So there is a contingent of finger waggy 30-some-year-old white women out there who want to make sure that they know that you're wrong about whatever, and they're woke and you're not. And so, I'm not writing for them, so I don't really care. They're not interested in learning other perspectives. So
Speaking of feedback, one thing I wanted to ask you was, does anyone ever make the or comment or express anything about the phrase that I've seen in Christian fiction books, pray for us? Because when that happened, and I'm like, okay, so if that person dies, that mean that they didn't pray hard enough? Or, oh, this person lived, that's because their family prayed enough to save them. Does anybody ever
I've never had anybody ask me specifically about that, but it kind of goes back to what we were talking about with there are things where you don't understand why God wouldn't answer that particular prayer the way you wanted. And in some books, there's probably room to discuss why, but in this particular book, like you have to follow where the story is going. And so if that explanation would take away from the actual story, I would never put it in. It would have to be part of the actual story, where somebody said, why didn't this work? Did I not pray hard enough? And then you could have a discussion about it. But yeah, I struggle with that a lot lately. And all of my family does too.
Yeah. Well, another thing on that subject that I like to think is that when people say my prayers weren't answered, I think as a parent, my children have petitioned me for many things over the years, but the answer has not always been yes.
Yes.
Sometimes the answer is no, because I
Yep.
have a different perspective and I can
Yep.
see what would be in their best interest. And so I trust that when the answer to my prayers is no, it's because God has a bigger perspective and he knows what's better for me than what I can figure out for myself.
The other thing I've been thinking about a lot lately, both in my own situation with my father's death, and then also in a number of scriptures that we've run into in both what my husband's preaching through right now and in the Sunday school that I'm leading and a couple other places, it keeps coming up that there are a number of times when so let's, as an example, the Canaanite woman who is asking Jesus to heal her daughter from demon possession, and Jesus responds eventually with, I didn't come for you, I came for the children of Israel, and it's not good to give the dogs the bread meant for the children, that story. Which seems really harsh at first, but he does eventually heal her daughter because of her great faith. But what's interesting about that story to me is that the very first thing you hear is that this woman's pleading and pleading and pleading, and the disciples say to Jesus, will you please send her away? They don't say, why aren't you answering her prayer? They want to send her away. And that's one example of a few other stories that we've been looking at where it's the people around the situation who are being taught. It's not that the Canaanite, like Jesus knew that he was going to heal that woman's daughter. He had to have, because he's omniscient. But he was using that as an opportunity to teach the people around him. And so when I have, when my father died and my sister and I were taking care of him the last week of his life when he had a very sudden turn 24/7. My sister is not a believer. And so the way in which I experienced that, the way in which my dad experienced that as a believer, and the way in which my mom experienced it are all witnesses to my sister. And maybe the way our dad died was for her benefit. And so I think about those types of things, like who is it who's watching this prayer not get answered, who might be being brought closer to God.
Oh, that's nice. Beautiful.
I feel like Christine had her hand up.
I did. This is totally off topic, so I apologize. It's more back to the story a little bit.
That's okay.
The character of little George, had you always planned for him to be so evil and nasty? Or did that just kind of happen?
That's a good question. And nobody's actually ever asked me about that, which is interesting because I've done more book clubs with this book than any of my other ones. I did not have any plans whatsoever for him when he and his brothers arrived. it was in the writing of the book and seeing how things went and thinking, how would he react to this? What would be his feelings about this? What would be the complications of Mary being the do-gooder, complications for the rest of her family? Because a lot of times people, my best friend growing up, her parents, well, her mother was very involved in helping at their church, but she was not involved with being a very good mother to her. And so they clashed a lot. Even though if you knew my friend's mother from church, you would think she was the best person on earth, and she was so caring and so attentive and so helpful and just really gave of herself. When I was at their house, all they did was scream at each other. And I know that and the fact actually that her father was gone about 6 months out of the year doing work things really affected her relationship with them. So much so that as an adult, later on in life, we were talking, and her husband was there, and we started talking about her mom, and she's like, "Oh, so you saw it too?" And I'm like, "Of course I saw it. Like, anytime I was with you, I saw this." And she turned to her husband and said, "You see, I'm not crazy." Like, she had almost convinced that she made all of this up. And I'm like, no. So there are definitely things that as adults you do that affect your children, and you have no idea necessarily how. Because anytime you're a kid, you're meaning making all the time. You're making meaning out of everything that happens to you. And a lot of times you come up with the wrong thing, or you come up with the thing that works the best to comfort you or to help you. And you don't ever approach your parent about it. Or if you do approach your parent, you might get a really bad reaction. And so, okay, I won't do that anymore. So yeah, I didn't plan for him to be like that. I think it's just as the circumstances of the narrative worked out, I thought, well, the kids aren't all going to be happy with this. There's going to be somebody who's not. I didn't know he was going to be that evil, though. Well, and the other thing is, like, yes, he's evil, but he wasn't really trying to poison her. So he was trying to poison somebody else. He wasn't trying to poison his mother. So that's not quite as bad. I don't know.
I love that ending, though. I didn't see it coming. It was a really good. I mean, of course, you don't want that to happen in real life, but literary reading and entertainment, it was very entertaining.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I want to respect everyone's time, and we've been at it for about an hour, but I just, in reflecting of the title of this, we hope for better things. And when I think of this storyline and the way things were in the 1860s for race relations, the way they were in 1960s, yes, better. The way they are today, yes, better, but there's still work to be done. So we can continue to hope for better things. And I just think that's such a beautiful title for this work. So
thank you.
We love the book. We appreciate you, and we appreciate you taking your time and sharing with us tonight. And we love your story.
Well, thank you so much. It was really, really great talking to you guys. I love talking about this book, and it was really fun to see Krista here. I didn't know that you were going to be here. I really appreciate it, and I hope that you guys run into a lot of other great books for your book club.